Part 83. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 833. Okay, listeners, today, our Golden Melody Years program ends here. Welcome everyone to listen to our program tonight. Tomorrow, we will be on FM 92.9 Nantong Music and Traffic Radio. See you there. Taking off her earphones, Sister Lu reached out and pinched her wrist as a habit. Then she stood up. At this time, the operators and assistants outside all maintained a motionless freeze motion, as if time had stopped at this moment. Still key. The door of the studio was pushed open from the outside. There is a new order. The middle-aged man closed the taxi app on his mobile phone, leaned against the doorframe, and watched the woman walk out. It's quite hot today, so you don't need to wear a coat, the man said. Sister Lu smiled, ignored the man's hypocrisy, and put her coat on her shoulders as usual. A peaceful life is a kind of depression, but the longer it is suppressed, the more violent the storm will come. Subai may not have thought at all that his cheap parents have been living in the city of Nantong, which is only an hour's drive from Shanghai, where he used to live. But today, it seems a little different. The man walked in front and the woman followed. Along the way, everyone they met stood still and motionless. The entire radio station office building was silent, like a painting cut out of the human world, looking a little cold. It's scary, and there are actually not many people here. Should we go to that barbecue stall? The man asked. Sister Lu nodded. The two people walked out of the gate and walked towards the barbecue stall run by a Sichuan couple. But before they could walk past, a police car suddenly stopped on the side of the road. A man in black shorts was eating barbecue at the barbecue stall. The man in the sleeves immediately stood up and prepared to run away. However, a man and a woman stood up from the table next to him and quickly pounced on him to subdue him. The person who got out of the police car was Chu Zhao. In real life, he has always played his own role. Over the past year, as he has solved more and more cases, his reputation in the circle has also increased. He is older, but his character of not caring about the influence has really annoyed some people above him. Some things that could have been suppressed, some things that could have been tolerated, were completely ignored by Chu Zhao. People like this can be called officials, but it is difficult to really sit in a high position, or in other words, destined not to become a politician. But for Chu Zhao, he actually doesn't care about many things at all. Because he doesn't care, he is strong without desire. In fact, whether you are a police officer or any other industry, it is a kind of happiness if you can completely ignore other people's opinions of you and concentrate on doing what you want to do, regardless of all the gains and losses. How could Chu Zhao survive every crisis in the story world and continue to compromise in the real world? Not everyone can do Subai, but for the audience, it can at least be a little more arbitrary in the real world. The fugitive was caught. Chu Zhao stood on the side of the road and lit a cigarette. This was an arrest across urban areas. He did not notify his colleagues in the local public security system in advance, so Chu Zhao planned to wait here for a while some handovers and explanations were still needed. Just do it now to save yourself the trouble later. Just when he blew out a smoke ring, Chu Zhao happened to turn around and saw a man and a woman walking towards the barbecue stall. Normal people would probably subconsciously stay away when they see the police and plainclothes arresting fugitives. For ordinary people, seeking advantages and avoiding disadvantages is just an instinct, but this man and woman walked over casually and sat down at the small table. Down. The boss and his wife stood beside the police with some trepidation. The other two tables of customers paid their money and left immediately without eating anything. Several police officers were sitting on plastic stools, and the fugitive was handcuffed and pinned to the ground motionless. This was a turmoil, and the boss and his wife actually did not suffer any losses, but it was obvious that today's business could not continue for the time being, and they had no intention of doing it themselves. But when she saw old customers coming to the door, the proprietress felt a little embarrassed. She thought that after the police matter here was settled, she would make a brain dish for Sister Lu if she hadn't left yet. Chu Zhao held a cigarette between his fingers and continued to look at the man and the woman. They were very ordinary people. They looked to be in their early 30s, but they looked very calm. There were many police officers sitting around them, but they remained calm and composed. Even people who have never broken any laws and are clean will subconsciously feel fear when faced with the police badge and this uniform. This is something that the state machine has ingrained into the hearts of people through decades of propaganda. This is also true in the West. Gradually, Chu Zhao stopped smoking, and even the cigarette butts burned to his fingertips, and he didn't seem to notice at all. Because I was curious from the beginning. By the time I get to know each other later. The speculation after that and the shock now. Chu Zhao suddenly realized. It seems that I have discovered something extraordinary. People from the local police station came, but Bureau Chu, who led the team, was missing. Fortunately, both Chu Zhao's policemen and the local police knew his character well, and no one was angry about it. After all, the shadow man of the tree was with his reputation. Everyone at least secretly admired Chu Zhao. However, Director Chu, who was now admired by many, looked a little trembling while walking behind the two. He and Subai were playmates since childhood, and they had met Subai's parents. Although he didn't know Subai's exact life experience, two people who were supposed to have died in a car accident nearly 20 years ago suddenly appeared. In front of him, there was extremely huge pressure on him. What's more, these two people look very young. Lu Menjiao and Su Yuhang didn't say anything to Chu Zhao, because there was really no need to say anything. They deliberately appeared in front of Chu Zhao, just to use Chu Zhao's eyes and ears to convey some information to the radio. It's simple, even boring. Today, is it about to begin? Lu Menjiao took off his coat and placed it on the flower bed on one side. At this moment, his graceful and mature figure was revealed. When people face important things, they always dress themselves up subconsciously, not for vanity, but for respect. When respecting others, you are actually respecting yourself. Haven't you been waiting for a long time? Su Yuhang smiled. Even though he had been a driver for several years, his elegant temperament was something that was infiltrated into his bones and could not be worn away by time. Flat. Lizzie, we should be back soon, and the train will be back at the station soon. Lu Menjiao raised her head and looked at the night sky. Tonight, the moon and stars were sparse, but Lu Menjiao seemed to see an eye in the night sky, staring at it. Own. That eye has been searching for me for a long time, and I have been avoiding it for a long time, but today, I don't need to hide anymore. You deal with your son's side. If you fight back, start from his side. He is our arrangement and the fuse we have buried all this time. Our arrangement ends with him and takes effect. At that time, we should start from him first, Lu Menjiao said to Su Yuhang. Why didn't you go? Su Yuhang asked. He doesn't have my last name. Lu Menjiao smiled slightly. No matter what, at least he has your last name Su for so many years, and you, the father, should finally light it up. Chu Zhao listened with fear. At this moment, he was no longer the detective, but a member of the audience circle. In front of Lu Menjiao and Su Yuhang, two almost epic-level beings, he was really oppressed. I couldn't even speak. Have you considered failure? Su Yuhang seemed to agree to Lu Menjiao's arrangement. We don't have the option of failure. Lu Menjiao stretched out her hand, put it on Chu Zhao's shoulder, and patted it gently. This made Chu Zhao feel like an elephant was greeting his aunt. You can go, I don't need you anymore, it already knows. Chu Zaoru was granted amnesty and left immediately. He even fell on the ground while running. But even if other audience members knew about it, they would not laugh at him, because if anyone else met this man and woman in this position, they would not laugh at him. Even if the big boss Liang Sen comes in person, there seems to be no essential difference. Our sky has been dark for too long. Su Yuhang slowly stood up straight and sighed, we have been patient for too long. Since you accepted the fruit we arranged for you, then you can be prepared to suffer the consequences of a toxic episode. Lu Menjiao sat down on the bench next to him. The moon and stars are sparse. The breeze comes slowly. Blow away the heat of the scorching heat. And she was like a docile wife sitting next to her husband who was doing impromptu recitation, watching her husband's performance. A ball of blue flame rose from Su Yuhang's palm. It's like the trumpet before the war. It is also a declaration of decisive battle. Anyone who knew about the existence of a man and a woman, including Subai himself, did not expect that the man and the woman would choose to take the initiative to walk in front of the broadcaster today, at this time, and declare war on radio. Of course. All this is just because the story world that Subai has entered now is a good opportunity for them. Bronze box, 2 suns, yellowed photos. The layout that has been buried for 20 years. Hidden for 20 years. Currently. Finally, the ferocity that should belong to it was revealed. There were no loud noises or shouts, just a man holding a fire in the park. There was only one woman sitting on a bench on one side and watching calmly. Even the big-name listeners in the nearby area did not notice the slightest abnormality. And in a place separated by infinite space, a train is driving in the wilderness. A woman by the car window slowly opened her eyes at this moment. Has it started? Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 834. When a boss-level audience appears, the dispute has actually come to an end, because once a person of this level appears, if there is no one of the same level on the other side, there will be no resistance at all. This is no longer a scale that is out of balance, but a scale that has been directly smashed. And the big-name audience in India probably don't dare to come here. This territorial dispute is different from that of a country. It has many historical issues and even multiple considerations from all parties. The audience in this circle is sometimes really impulsive. Within the bounds of reason, the audience is really not afraid of making things completely fussy. In the end, everyone is a desperado. Once the big-name audience in India attempts to cross the border, it will be a slap in the face to all the big-name audiences in China. Not only Zhao Bianan, but also Liang Sen, who is far away in Shanghai, will probably not be able to sit still and will definitely rush over immediately. Come over. If only 1 or 2 of you come, then I will leave you completely and let you perish here. If a group of you come, then do it. Let's see which side has more boss-level listeners. The audience camp in the entire world has always been divided into 2 categories, East and West. China is the main representative of the Eastern camp, and Western Europe is the main representative of the Western camp. This can also reflect the 2 regions. There is a huge gap between the strength of the audience and the strength of the audience in other areas nearby. Just because of the high-pressure policy of broadcasting, it is of course impossible for listeners to form a group and fight for territory in the real world, but if the other side dares to cross the line, the listeners here will naturally not mind a group fight. In a word, simply put, they bully you based on their size. The head of the old woman who was just about to launch a sneak attack was gently picked off by Zhao Bianan. The headless corpse stepped back in horror. Zhao Bianan only took off her head and did not destroy her soul. Putting people to death, but the warning and anger in it are already very clear and understandable. The 3 bodhisattvas on the fat man's side had just managed to withstand the bombardment of the thunder, when they felt a pain in their chests at the same time. At this time, their hearts and livers were dug out directly, and there was a piece left on their chests. In the huge cave, the 3 bodhisattvas retreated in shock. On the other side, the female bodhisattva who was sitting with the Buddha and discussing the Buddha felt a terrible thought cut across her, abruptly cutting off her thoughts and severely traumatizing her soul. Then she quickly stood up and vomited. He quickly retreated after taking a mouthful of golden blood. The 5 bodhisattvas had no power to fight back in front of this big boss. Although Zhao Bianan did not kill anyone, his attacks were quite severe. The 4 bodhisattvas' real bodies were basically beaten into pieces by him. The female bodhisattvas, the damage to the soul is even more serious. After doing this, Zhao Bianan appeared next to the monk again and placed his palm between the monk's eyebrows. You have a great chance of achieving consummation, so it's a pity to advance so abruptly. After saying that, a ray of gentle power was injected into the monk's body from Zhao Bianan's palm. The momentum of the monk's advancement slowly faded under the warmth of the spring breeze, and the monk himself also followed the trend and poured this power into the monk's body. Advancement has stopped. Immediately, the monk clasped his hands together and chanted a Buddha's name to Zhao Bianan, who took action. No matter what, this favor is owed today. Although it would be weird for a senior person to say that he owes a favor to a big boss, the monk does things based on his own heart. At least, he thinks that he owes Zhao Bianan a favor. Zhao Bianan paid special attention to the monk. If it were someone else, Zhao Bianan would not help him suppress the tendency to advance. However, after observing the monk closely, Zhao Bianan understood why India sent people. I came to arrest him and left. A senior person who has the opportunity to become a high-level listener of Dzogchen represents a kind of luck, or even destiny. If such a person is captured, and there is a person in India who is about to become enlightened, for senior listeners, if the luck belonging to the monk is robbed, the success rate of enlightenment, that is, the success rate of taking that step, will increase a lot. At that time, facing the temptation of enlightenment, the punishment caused by robbing people's luck would not be so concerned. Moreover, under broadcasting's consistent policy of indulgence, Chen Ryu could even enter the place of enlightenment to steal tombstones. I feel that if other listeners choose other heretical ways, they can also get a certain degree of understanding from the broadcaster. After all, maybe for broadcasters, the big guys who can prove the truth are the products he needs, and the rest can only be called raw materials, and he doesn't mind sacrificing some. My lord, you are not afraid of being so ruthless. The female bodhisattva's face was a little livid, not because she was angry, but because the damage to her soul made her have a tendency to have inner demons. As the saying goes, you can become a Buddha with just one thought and become a demon with just one thought. This female bodhisattva should follow a cultivation model with demons as the base, Buddha as the upper end, and using the Buddha to control the demons. However, the Buddha soul at the upper end was seriously injured, and the foundation naturally began to be suppressed. Can't stand it anymore. Roll. Zhao Bianan glanced at the 5 bodhisattvas. He had no intention of chatting or negotiating terms, because these 5 people were not worthy. At the same time, Senran's murderous intent leaked out. This was genuine murderous intent, and as a boss-level audience, there was really no need to scare people at this time. The 5 crippled bodhisattvas no longer dared to speak and submerged into the Urhai lake one after another. They did not dare to make any other movements. It is estimated that the only thought in their hearts now was to quickly disappear in front of this man and return to India. It's strange. India is so interesting. Isn't it Hinduism there? How come all the listeners have become bodhisattvas? The fat man muttered beside him. This may have something to do with some ancient inheritances. Maybe some secret inheritances in India are mainly Buddhist. Lord Buddha came over and saluted Zhao Bianan with one hand to show respect. Because of Journey to the West, most Chinese people in India think that Buddhism is the largest religion there, but in fact Buddhism only once flourished in India, and now more than 80% of Indians believe in Hinduism, then Islam, Sikhism and Christianity. No matter what, Zhao Bianan just helped, so he deserves to be grateful, otherwise the 5 bodhisattvas, Buddha and Fatty alone would not be able to stop them. Zhao Bianan just said a word to the monk and ignored Buddha and Fatty. After confirming that the 5 bodhisattvas were indeed escaping to India, his figure disappeared on the spot. It seems that people don't bother to compete and communicate with people like us, Fatty joked from the side. Fatty has always had a good mentality. He hugs thighs, has no lower limit, pretends to be a pig and eats tigers, etc. Fatty doesn't do it at all. Psychological stress. Monk, does it have a big impact if your promotion is interrupted? Buddha is more concerned about the monk's situation. The monk nodded. It will cause the difficulty to increase the next time you advance. Wouldn't that be troublesome? Fatty said angrily. He knew how difficult it was to advance. It would be too polite to let them go like this. I don't feel relieved. The difficulty has changed from very easy to easy, the monk explained. Fatty. Buddha. Zhao Bianan took the old woman's head and placed it on the grass, then used it as a chair to sit on it. The pieces of heart and liver were casually thrown away by him. Soon, a few chickens raised by the owner of a nearby B/U0026B, the dogs were immediately attracted and began to nibble on the items. They are not human, but they are more sensitive to good things than ordinary people. Still didn't kill anyone. Chen Ryu still stood there. Zhao Bianan came back after solving the problems of the 5 bodhisattvas very quickly, but Chen Ryu didn't even move a step. You are very murderous, Zhao Bianan said with a smile. That woman named Li Ji wiped out an entire city, Chen Ryu said. She has a reason for that. Zhao Bianan seemed to know something inside, but he had no intention of saying it. He just stretched gently. Sometimes, I feel it's quite boring. Suddenly, Zhao Bianan's voice stopped, as if he had discovered something. He froze on the spot. What's wrong? Chen Ryu asked. Zhao Bianan was stunned for a long time, with a look of surprise on his brows. No, something must have happened. This is wrong, this is wrong. Chen Ryu stood aside, waiting for Zhao Bianan. The radio will monitor us, you know, right? Zhao Bianan seemed to be asking Chen Ryu, but also seemed to be talking to himself. To a certain extent, although Chen Ryu did not prove the truth, Zhao Bianan still put it in an almost equal position with him, because Chen Ryu's combat power is infinitely close to that of the big boss after the Enlightenment. Otherwise it would be impossible for Subai to hold the Jade Seal of the Dian Kingdom in the home court of the Enlightenment, and there is nothing he can do about it. Woman. It's like the neighbor who lives opposite you is spying on you with a telescope. Chen Ryu used an analogy. This is how she feels. You are very powerful, but because you have not attained enlightenment, I feel differently from you. My feeling is that I am like a piece of cell tissue being placed on a glass dish, and directly above me is observe everything about me with a microscope. Belongs to broadcasting eyes. Then you just now, that I disappeared, Zhao Bianan replied. At the same time, he raised his head and looked at the sky. It no longer monitors me. Why is that? Perhaps it thinks that I no longer need to be monitored, but I think this is impossible, so there is only one reason left. That's its focus at the moment. Not enough. Zhao Bianan had an incredulous expression. Even though he was a big-shot listener, precisely because he stood higher, he had a clearer and more intuitive understanding of the vastness of the sky and the horror of radio. In the end, what happened? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 835. Life is always full of all kinds of accidents, and there are many surprises. When you are deceived by the gurgling stream in front of you, you may see a towering cliff waterfall just around the next corner. For example, today's monks still sit cross-legged by the Urhai lake and recite scriptures. For example, the current Buddha is still walking on Kangshan mountain, touching the veins of the mountains and rivers. For example, the current fat man is still hugging each other in a nightclub in downtown Delhi, enjoying the blessings of being together. For example, Xiezhen is still sitting in the company's office, looking at the game promotion plan that was just released. For example, Liang Sen is still lying on his bed, holding a copy of Homer's Epic and flipping through it. For example, there are many such examples. Ordinary people are still living their own ordinary lives. No matter how thrilling and ups and downs they are, they still cannot escape from the ordinary category. The listeners are also living their own lives, being played with, teased, struggling, angry, and roaring in the shadow of the radio. But a gust of wind blows. The two people walking at the front had already stood up, because they had walked too far, so far that the third person behind could not even see their backs. So, this storm, this duel. Even for the audience, those who can detect something strange are only a minority among the minority. Undercurrent. It's already surging. Zhao Bianan has been sitting on the hillside from morning to late at night. The night in Dali is beautiful and the starry sky is bright, but there is no trace of the star that follows him everywhere and can even be described as a tarsal maggot. Give. Chen Ru threw over a bottle of wine, a bottle of Lao Baigan. Zhao Bianan took a sip and made a hoarse sound in his throat. Then he stood up and closed his eyes. From the feeling, Chen Ru felt that Zhao Bianan knew what was happening, and even knew who the culprit was. However, Zhao Bianan's emotions made Chen Ru a little confused. Expect. Hesitant. Frightened. Depressed. Okay, the time is up, let's enter the voting time. When I ask you who you think the murderer is, you must give me an answer, and this answer cannot be changed, the old housekeeper said seriously. Everyone nodded. In fact, this rule was already understood by everyone when they voted for Hills for the first time. Although there is no voting button on the electronic light screen, the old butler is the rule here. The old housekeeper stood in front of Su Gang first, and Su Gang replied, Zhao Rui. The old housekeeper walked up to Diana, and Diana replied, Zhao Rui. The old housekeeper walked up to Chen Ming, and Chen Ming replied, Zhao Rui. The old housekeeper walked up to Lucy, and Lucy replied, Zhao Rui. Then, the old housekeeper walked up to Muntali, who was still hesitating. Even though the blackened traces on the strings were very clear, and even if all the evidence and logic pointed to Zhao Rui's suicide, Muntali still felt strange. This is a kind of intuition, which can also be regarded as a sixth sense. He didn't answer, he looked at Sudbai. At this moment, Sudbai reached out and picked up the teapot on the coffee table, poured himself a cup of tea, took a sip, and said, Yi Wang. Sudbai gave his answer first. He voted for himself, because at this time, it no longer mattered. 4 people voted for Zhao Rui. This situation could no longer be changed. At this time, Lucy looked at Sudbai with a very angry look, while Diana seemed to have been drained of all her strength. Chen Ming smiled coquettishly, and Su Gang covered his head. Muntari said with some emotion, Is this the wisdom and planning of senior listeners? It's possible, like the guy who was voted out in the first round, there was no psychological pressure on Sudbai to step on Hills at this time. Well, I'm convinced that I lost. Muntali looked at it with openness, because the ending has been decided, and now he should focus on the next scene. Moreover, Muntari is a smart man after all. He would not be like that woman Lucy, who first planned to kill Sudbai and now showed such anger. The other party is a senior audience member. You have already offended him. If you continue to offend him at this time, do you really think that he will not be able to target you in the subsequent scenes? Sudbai didn't have the elation of a winner. In fact, he could feel the feeling of Hills in this game. It was not so much Hill's excessive self-aggrandizement that made Sudbai find evidence of his crime. It was Hills who was using another way to express his disdain for playing games with this group of non-senior listeners. Of course, Hills lost this game, and Sudbai was now the winner. Naturally, he could disrespectfully label Hills with various philosophical styles. That's all. Subai sat on the sofa and watched the old housekeeper force Lucy, Muntali, Diana, Sugang, and Chenming into the wall one after another. Seeing him building Isolo, watching him entertaining guests, watching his building collapse, Subai suddenly remembered the sentence from the Peach Blossom fan in his mind. Rational reasoning, thinking, and bloody and brutal violent punishment constantly appear alternately in this scene. The former pave the way for the latter, and the latter renders the former. The contrast in emotion and rhythm. It seems to be in line with the storytelling that radio pursues, or the aesthetics of radio. Subai poured himself another cup of tea, and then poured a cup for the old housekeeper who had finished his work. The old butler picked up the tea and took a sip. "Do I need to be squeezed in too?" Subai pointed at himself and asked. "No, didn't you find that door?" the old housekeeper said to Subai. "As the winner of the game, you should receive some preferential treatment." "Thanks." "You're welcome." The old housekeeper sat down opposite Subai. He looked at Subai like an antique. In fact, the old housekeeper didn't pay much attention to Subai's plans and arrangements, as well as his reaction during the argument. This only shows that Subai has greater courage and more careful calculations than other game participants. Of course, there is also an element of luck here. For example, even Subai himself did not expect that he would be attacked by zombies when he was preparing to kill Zhao Rui that night. What really interested the old housekeeper was what Subai had said to him before about what he was interested in broadcasting. The old butler is an NPC in this story world. Because the radio likes the story world, he exists. Because the radio constantly sends listeners here, he has a sense of relative existence. It's not that he wants to study how to flatter radio broadcasters, because his existence is to make radio broadcasts happier, and to provide radio broadcasts with more and better storytelling is the meaning of his existence. It's quite sad when a person lives because of this. Subai looked at the old housekeeper sitting in front of him and thought like this. But with the lessons learned from the previous black convenience store owner and the devil in the painting, after a period of renovation and maintenance, the broadcast will no longer allow awakened NPCs to appear in the story world. Or, you can awaken, but you must be obedient. For example, when you enter the story world of Cinderella for the second time, you see the Pope. For example, take the old housekeeper in front of you now. Subai took a deep breath and drank all the tea in the cup in his hand. "Please." The old housekeeper put the teacup down and motioned for Subai to follow him upstairs. Subai did not hesitate and followed the old housekeeper to the second floor. The two of them walked towards the deepest room, which was the room where Hills discovered the passage. The old housekeeper reached out and moved the bed away, and walked down the corridor with Subai. The metal door in front of him had a heavy and depressing feeling inherent in this material. The old housekeeper stood in front of him and verified his fingerprints first and then his pupils. Click. A crisp sound. The door was opened. It was pitch black inside. The old housekeeper turned sideways and motioned for Subai to come in. Subai smiled and took 2 steps forward. When he was about to enter, he stopped and looked at the old housekeeper. "This scene is over, so what are you going to do next?" The old housekeeper looked at Subai and replied, "I'm going to clean the house, especially the kitchen." This was a farewell to the old housekeeper. Subai turned around and walked in the door. When the old butler standing behind Subai watched Subai go in, it was like a flower in front of his eyes. He seemed to see a blue flame, but the flame slowly disappeared as Subai disappeared. The old housekeeper's task was over. He covered the corridor and the bed again, and then walked out of the room. Then, he picked up the broom and mop, preparing to clean the entire villa first. He didn't use the clone, because if he used the clone, no matter how much work he had to do, he could finish it quickly. He likes this kind of work, and likes to slowly repair and restore the traces produced after a game, and hopes that this process can be as long as possible. Perhaps. It's probably because it's too boring. However, when the old housekeeper came to the stairs with a bucket and mop, he suddenly frowned. He looked at the living room below, at the dining room and kitchen, and at the bedroom that had been occupied like a small hotel. At last, he looked at the blood-red wall, and suddenly he felt disgusted. It was as if there was a fire burning in his chest. He knew this feeling shouldn't happen, but he couldn't control it. Slowly, like a puppet, the old butler threw away the bucket and mop and watched the water pouring all over the floor. Then he went down the stairs and walked to the blood-red wall in the living room. In front of this wall, he once stuffed people who had failed in the game one by one, watched their flesh and blood, watched them turn into meat and blood. Suddenly, the old housekeeper leaned his forehead against the wall. Bang! 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 He started hitting the wall with his forehead. Each time is heavier than the last. Louder every time. Gradually, he began to be bloody and bloody. Slowly, his blood soaked on the wall began to be slowly absorbed by the squirming wall. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 836. The blue flame was suspended in Su Yuhang's palm, with a strange sense of coquettishness, as if it had the power to confuse people's hearts. It is beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful, but it is a terrible poison. Even valid for broadcast. Lu Menjiao put one hand on the bench and gently supported the side of his face. Having been here like this for so many years, it seems that I have become accustomed to peace and have integrated into it. So, even if they now get their long-cherished wish and officially come out of the shadows to face the behemoth that has suppressed them for most of their lives. But there is still no feeling of passion and excitement. Even Lu Menjiao himself suddenly felt something. This scene. It was a bit deserted. When seniors face younger generations, they always like to encourage them with "I am not alone in my path," but for Su Yuhang and Lu Menjiao, at least now, when they look back, there is no one who can speak. Ahead is an unknown horror. Later. Then there is no one. Perhaps the reason why they have been able to live together as husband and wife until now is because they only see each other around. Is it lit? Lu Menjiao asked, as if he were asking her husband at home, is the meal ready? It's lit. Su Yuhang smiled, turned his palm, and the blue flame blended into the surroundings and entered the void. He clapped his hands, and then stretched out his hand to Lu Menjiao, who was leaning on the bench. Lu Menjiao ignored it. She also knew that it was impossible for her and Su Yuhang to fall in love for a long time, even if they had given birth to 2 children. Su Yuhang often did this in these years. If you were facing an ordinary girl, you might be touched by this small gesture, because Su Yuhang is very handsome and good at playing music, chess, calligraphy, and painting. But in Lu Menjiao's view, this is just Su Yuhang's fear that this life will be too monotonous and bored, so he just added some color to his own drama. Lu Menjiao, who was supposed to cooperate with the performance, turned a blind eye, stood up directly, and walked to Su Yuhang's side. 2 white lights fell exactly at this moment. These 2 white lights were exactly the same as when radio broadcasts were transmitted to listeners in the past. The blood corpse also encountered this situation when the fat man shouted the word Yezi, and was then pulled into the story world by the broadcast in such a way to be killed. Now, Su Yuhang and Lu Menjiao will face the exact same situation. After all, in the real world, radio has no power, but once you enter the story world, radio is the real master. Neither Lu Menjiao nor Su Yuhang resisted, they just stood there quietly waiting to be teleported. There was even a look of nostalgia on their faces. This feeling of being transported into the story world is already a relatively distant memory for them. When the white light disappeared, what was revealed in front of Su Yuhang and Lu Menjiao was a barren desert. In the sky, instead of the scorching sun, there was a bloody bright moon, like a huge eye looking down. There's nothing new. Su Yuhang shook his head slightly, as if he was a little dissatisfied with the broadcast that pulled him into such a story world. Because it's too cliché. It's too deliberate. Perhaps, for other listeners, it would be enough to be proud to be treated like this by the radio, but for Su Yuhang, it is far from enough. Su Yuhang's figure slowly rose up, suspended in mid-air, while Lu Menjiao squatted down, reached out and grabbed a handful of sand, and watched the fine sand dripping out from between his fingers, revealing a trace of smile. "Don't you like stories the most?" In the air, Su Yuhang shouted to the blood moon above, with a touch of ridicule and contempt in his tone. "Don't you like novelty the most? Don't you just like to pursue this? Don't you like innovation the most?" Boom! A huge tremor came from the depths of the desert, and then, a towering pyramid slowly emerged from the sea of sand. This pyramid was hundreds of times larger than the pyramids in the real world. With a human body in front of it, really like an ant. Desert, pyramid, is it time for a demon to appear below? Faced with this huge change, Su Yuhang remained calm and calm. "We haven't seen each other for so many years, but you are not as interesting as before." Su Yuhang lowered his voice. "Are you afraid? You followed the rules and took the initiative to accept the fruit I sent you. Now the poison of the fruit has begun to take effect. You are afraid and you don't dare to continue playing with us. Right?" Su Yuhang opened his arms. He was very small in front of this towering pyramid, but under this black sky, he seemed very tall. "Come on, answer me. I know you have your own procedures, and I know you have your own rules, but I know even more that you have your own likes and dislikes, and you have your own emotions. Come, answer me. Tell me. Are you still in control of everything as before? Tell me. Are you still in your calculations as before? Don't tell me you're really scared. Don't tell me you're really panicked. Otherwise I really will. Very disappointed." A flash of thunder burst out in Su Yuhang's eyes, as if there was a sea of stars hidden in his eyes. At the same time, a demon with a wolf head and body appeared on the top of the pyramid. This is Anubis, the god who guides the dead in Egyptian mythology. Oh! Amid this wolf howl, it seemed as if the sky was shaking. Immediately, the other party stepped on the void step by step and walked towards Su Yuhang from the top of the pyramid. With each step, the distance moved thousands of meters. Therefore, even though the two were far apart before, they quickly became closer. Facing Anubis' approach, Su Yuhang's eyes still fell on the blood moon above his head. "You are my opponent. As for this so-called Egyptian god you fabricated, what is it?" Lu Menjiao was still playing with the sand below. The story world created by the broadcast was cold and pure, without any impurities. As for the matters in the sky, as well as the pyramid and the one that came out of the pyramid, Lu Menjiao believed that her nominal husband could solve it. Broadcasting needs time to deal with things on that side, and they also need time to let the poison of the fruit spread as much as possible. Anubis held a trident in his hand and stabbed Su Yuhang directly. For a moment, the space began to vibrate and distort, and a broken void appeared at the tip of the trident. Snapped. But when Anubis tried to take another step forward, he saw the man reaching out his hand and gently grabbing the tip of the trident. Even the gods showed a look of horror at this time. "Are you afraid?" Su Yuhang showed a sarcastic smile. When he was making NPC, his obsessive-compulsive disorder was still there. After speaking, Su Yuhang flipped his palm, and Anubis's trident instantly collapsed and turned into dust and dispersed around. Then, Su Yuhang pointed with confidence. Boom! A bolt of crimson thunder seemed to tear apart the sky and fell, illuminating the night here like day. Anubis' body was pierced by thunder, his soul was directly strangled, his whole body burned, and he fell down. A deep black pit was burned out in the desert below. Su Yuhang killed a demon in an understatement, but Su Yuhang didn't feel much joy. This was just a doll made up by the broadcast, not a real trick. Sure enough, the next moment, the huge pyramid began to melt. Immediately afterwards, the temperature of this desert also increased at an alarming rate. The sand began to melt and the magma began to rise. Here. From the desert to purgatory in the blink of an eye. But where Lu Menjiao squatted, the sand was still sand, and no matter how the magma roared around her, it could not get closer to her. In the air, loud noises were heard, and the sky was torn open like a piece of plastic paper. Huge palms protruded from the sky, carrying the power of destroying the world and grabbing at it. Su Yuhang in the sky. Su Yuhang raised his head, opened his hands, and a writing brush appeared in his hand. The sky is the paper and faith is the pen. For a time. From the beginning of becoming an audience to the 2 decades of anonymous planning. Scene after scene. Moment by moment. Quickly appeared in Su Yuhang's mind. Su Yuhang held the pen in his hand and started painting. Those terrifying giant hands began to collapse as soon as they were about to touch Su Yuhang's body. They rushed forward one after another, but they were unable to shake Su Yuhang in the slightest. Even though this is a story world designed by broadcast to suppress the 2 people, it seems that there is something. Nothing can be done about them. Click. A huge crisp sound. The sky collapsed. A huge ghostly face pressed down, seemingly roaring with the resentment and unwillingness of the entire story world. At this moment, Lu Menjiao, who had been playing in the sand, stood up and story world, Lu Menjiao murmured to himself, raised his palm. A green vine grew out of the sand at Lu Menjiao's feet, but it grew bigger and taller, and finally roared upward at a terrifying speed like an arrow. He bypassed Su Yuhang and rushed towards the huge grimace. Clang! The ghost face was pierced by ivy, and the whole world began to distort. Even the blood moon in the sky. At this time it also became much darker than before. Do you like this storytelling? Su Yuhang didn't care at all about this twisted and collapsed story world, but continued to shout to the blood moon, answer me, does this satisfy your pursuit of storytelling? Now. It's not just you. Able to influence the world of this story? No surprise. Surprised or not? It's the 4th update today and it's still daytime. Is it unexpected or surprising? After the surprise, is it time to click the reward button to surprise Long? Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiao Long. Chapter 837. The sand in his hand is scattered one after another. The ivy growing out of the silver sand carries a wool belonging to Lu Menjiao. When this wool is strong enough, it can actually change the pattern of this story world. In other words, it was Lu Menjiao who found a way to communicate with the story world. After 20 years of dormancy, using the next generation as a tool to plan, it is indeed a shocking feeling when the cards they have accumulated are revealed. The more powerful the audience is, the deeper their understanding of radio is. This is the consensus of the audience circle, because the more powerful you are, the more times you have been tortured by the broadcaster, and you have gained experience through torture. When it comes to strength, contact with broadcasting, and understanding of broadcasting. Looking at 20 years, who in the audience circle can compare with this man and woman? The world around them is constantly collapsing and reorganizing at the same time. This man and woman have been standing here steadily. They no longer choose to attack actively. They need time to allow the fruit's toxicity to fully spread out. When the blood corpse rose up in anger, he drew his sword and looked around at a loss, unable to find the existence of the broadcast. However, Su Yuhang and Lu Menjiao came up with a way to actively force the broadcast out. This was their plan, a plan shaped by the pride and confidence of broadcasters, and now it's time to reap the rewards. Radio, in the eyes of other listeners, is an omnipotent existence. It operates according to rules and has its own moral principles, so it makes sense. But in the eyes of this man and woman, broadcasting is not omniscient and omnipotent, and broadcasting is not the rule. The real rules are like the automated production equipment in a factory, and the broadcast is just the person who controls the coffin, or even just a ball of consciousness. Therefore, radio has its own likes and dislikes, its own tendencies, and its own fun. But a rule, a terrifying power system with the ability to create and change the world, is impossible to give birth to this kind of consciousness. Once it is born, it will become an independent existence from the rule itself, just like the path to enlightenment. The formation spirit of the earth, after giving birth to spiritual intelligence, had no choice but to break away from the formation and go around to suck human essence and blood. Just like everyone in the real world thinks nuclear weapons are scary, but everyone is afraid of nuclear weapons not because of how powerful they are, but because these nuclear weapons that are enough to destroy the Earth are controlled by some organizations and forces. If nuclear weapons are simply placed together, there is actually nothing to be afraid of. As long as they are stored properly, they are not exposed to gasoline on the road and may spontaneously ignite. This is why Su Yuhang and Lu Menjiu dared to stand up and express their attitudes and positions to the radio at this time. Their opponent is not the rules, not omniscient and omnipotent, but just the consciousness of the group called broadcast and having the preferences of broadcast. For the vast majority of listeners, they don't even have this knowledge at all, otherwise Liang Sen wouldn't be so frightened that he curled up at the foot of the table and shivered when the broadcasting atmosphere came. Has it started? Su Yuhang looked at Lu Menjiu below. It should have already started. Lu Menjiu raised her head, looked at the sky that was constantly being broken and repaired, and said, "It's beautiful." Just like the sound of lights being turned on one after another, Subai's consciousness woke up in an instant. He took a deep breath habitually, but found that he was still lying in the container where he entered the story world at the beginning. It's indeed right. The essence of Zhao's villa should be the biological research laboratory below. Subai began to try to exert force, but the liquid that wrapped him up and down seemed to have a strange power, dissipating all of Subai's power. Even Subai couldn't tell clearly whether it was his own power that dissolved. In these liquids, his body had already been drained of all its strength. No, that's not right. I shouldn't have such doubts. Subai suddenly thought of this. No matter which of his previous guesses was correct, he shouldn't be unable to distinguish this kind of thing, because now he doesn't feel the lack of strength in his body, nor does he feel it. How special is the liquid surrounding him? So, where does the problem occur? When the last crack sound appeared, a stone tablet appeared in the darkness in front of Subai. The stone tablet was inlaid with a blue gem. The gem exuded a deep light green light, which made Subai subconsciously think of himself. The jade seal of the Dian kingdom was on the altar at the place of enlightenment, but the thing on the stone tablet in front of me was obviously weirder than the jade seal of the Dian kingdom. Because when Subai looked there, he could feel that his consciousness was about to be sucked in. It's this gem. It is suppressing my power, or in other words, the weakening effect of this gem has made me, a high-level listener, weaker than an ordinary person. Damn it, what the hell is this? Subai suddenly thought of the crystal in Superman that could make Superman weak. Surrounding Subai, there are 8 identical containers. The appearance of the containers looks similar to the biological research equipment in science fiction movies. It is enough to accommodate a person, but the space is still relatively narrow. A white ghost appeared next to the stone tablet, because her body was illusory, like a technical projection here, but it could be roughly seen that she was a woman. Welcome to your arrival. In fact, I have been waiting for you for a long time. I originally thought I would have to wait a little longer. The woman said a line similar to what an electronic arcade narrator would say. But in essence, there is not much difference between today's listeners and tourists who go to the amusement park to play games. It's just that the fun obtained by the amusement park tourists is their own, while the listeners contribute to the broadcast. Pleasure. This is Zhao's villa, a place built by genius scientists. The ghost continued, you are the audience, you have power beyond ordinary people. To ordinary people, you are even comparable to gods in myths and legends. However, in the long history of mankind, there have been many extraordinary figures. Whether in ancient times or in modern times, existences that can change the pattern of the plane will appear inadvertently. Sudbai was thinking in his mind while listening. In ancient times, they should be Alexander and Zilong. In modern times, should they be the original owners of Zhao's villa? Is there really a person who built Zhao's villa and then did his own research? The group that Sudbai had dealt with for a period of time also had pharmaceutical companies under it. If the other party was doing research on human biochemistry, the cost would only be much greater than drug research, and building a biological laboratory for researching new drugs would be much more expensive than drug research. What a huge cost! As far as Sudbai knew, even the laboratories affiliated to large pharmaceutical groups in Europe and the United States were gold-devouring beasts that made them feel miserable. If we really follow what this ghost said, then in other words, there is a guy in China who has huge hidden wealth and has done this research himself, and even attracted the attention of the radio. Sudbai thought of the Frankenstein he had met before. That guy combined magic and science. Both Sudbai and the black audience suffered at his hands, and the black audience was even killed by Frankenstein. You don't need to know who he is, but today you can feel the experimental project he did. I believe it will definitely not disappoint you. The ghost turned around and looked at the gem in front of him. This gem is a special material alloy, and it was his original work. Do you find it surprising that even high-level listeners can be suppressed by the power of gems? The people who cooperated with him in this experiment were also listeners from that period. For some reason, when the ghost said this, Sudbai felt that the ghost looked at him intentionally. Moreover, Sudbai felt that the tone and content of the NPC's speech became a bit stiff, which was different from the stories Sudbai had been exposed to before. The NPCs in the world are very different. For example, NPCs like the Pope, even if they knew about the existence of broadcasts, they would not say it openly. NPCs serve the background of the story world, but this woman's opening tone really ruined the atmosphere here. Sometimes there is no essential difference between dolls and ants. The former cannot help himself. The latter is insignificant. But human thinking and culture have given them different meanings, and this meaning, in Western terms, is lonely heroism, and in Eastern terms, it means that I have no control over my destiny. Very pale. It's also funny. But it's fun. Resisted again and again, struggled again and again. It is nothing more than being treated as an after-dinner pastime on the radio. Broadcasting gives you two choices, one is a regular way, the other is an irregular way. No matter which one you choose, broadcasting is happy to hear about it. Okay, no more nonsense. Let you have a taste of the real face of Zhao's villa. The ghost stretched out his hand, but it stopped in mid-air. Her words. It also came to an abrupt end. The air around seemed to have become quiet at this moment. At first, none of the 9 listeners in the 9 containers thought it was a big deal. Everyone was waiting with bated breath, waiting for the turmoil in this scene. However, when the ghost was frozen for more than 10 seconds, the 9 audience members present felt a little ridiculous in their hearts, because this weird scene seemed to have never been encountered by any of them in their story world experience. What's going on here? Did you stop moving after your opening remarks? If it weren't for being wrapped in liquid, Sudbai would really be dumbfounded now. This ghost before me. The NPCs in this story world. Is it down? Grass. Really dead. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 838. When you get used to the existence of something, when you get used to having one eye staring at your life all the time, when you get used to walking within the rules without daring to step out of the circle. Suddenly, all the constraints are gone, all the rules are gone. This feeling is really unbearable. Just like the head but not hair policy in the early Qing dynasty, how many people resisted to death in order to keep their buns, and when hair was cut during the Republic of China, how many people covered their heads to protect their braids and were unwilling to cut them off. This is the normal state of human nature and the normal state of listeners. To be precise, listeners are subject to greater constraints than ordinary people. For example, there are many unsolved cases in the world, and the real culprits are still at large, but the listeners cannot fool the radio at all, and even your thoughts may be understood by the radio. But at this moment, all big-name listeners around the world receive the same message push in different languages. This message is delivered through different media, but what is guaranteed is that the message is 100% delivered. Almost all the big-name listeners who received this message took the same action. Look up at the sky. Because the sky may have really changed. Boss, boss. Xie Zhen, who was wearing pajamas, directly opened the door of Liang Sen's bedroom. At this time, there was really no need to pay attention to etiquette. As the person who helped Liang Sen control this information all the year round, Xie Zhen knew the meaning of the message he had just received. What does it mean? Unexpectedly, when he opened the door, Xie Zhen saw Liang Sen sitting on the edge of the bed with a gloomy expression and one hand holding his chest. It seems that it is very important news, and they even did not hesitate to use this notification method from the story world to remind me. The pain was only temporary, and it seemed to be particularly fast this time. Liang Sen signaled to Xie Zhen that he could come over. Xie Zhen handed over his mobile phone and said at the same time, "The broadcast requires all big-name listeners to be responsible for the order of the local listeners." "It's very simple." Liang Sen frowned, then stood up and pushed open the floor-to-ceiling window, walked to the balcony, and raised his head. Due to the bad weather tonight, the night sky was dim, but Liang Sen could still clearly notice it. "I noticed something strange. Is something really wrong?" Boss Ji Zhen was waiting nearby. He knew that Liang Sen would explain some of the situation to him if possible. If it was not convenient for him to do so, he would not force it. There was something wrong with the broadcast. I felt something was wrong just as I was lying on the bed. It was as if the eye in the sky that had been staring at me suddenly disappeared, and then the broadcast message arrived. Liang Sen was playing with his phone in his hand, as if he was thinking about something. "I'm going to make some coffee." Xie Zhen retreated first. After a while, Liang Sen sighed, his eyes looking a little deep. He believed that he was not the only one who was as full of doubts as he was at this moment. If nothing else, the scope of this message push was definitely not limited to in one place. It is likely that big-name listeners from both the East and the West received the news. There is something wrong with the radio, which should be felt by the boss-level listeners, so the broadcaster sent this notice, which seems to require the boss-level listeners to implement regional control and management of the listener circle, but in fact it is not empowering. They have no special power, because the big-name audience who usually sit on one side will occasionally come forward to resolve some disputes. This news is not so much an admission by broadcasters that something is wrong with them. Rather, it is a warning. Warning to these boss-level listeners who are very sensitive to this. There is something wrong with it, but you have to continue to settle it for me. Otherwise, there are consequences at your own risk. It is estimated that non-boss level listeners will not receive this message because their senses are not so sensitive. At the same time, in order to maintain the stability of the entire circle when the broadcast loses monitoring, the broadcaster will not tell non-boss level listeners about this. On the contrary, they are the right choice. They cannot sense the specific existence of the broadcast, so they should continue to maintain the illusion that the broadcast is still staring at them. Anyway, they are used to it. Liang Sen's brows furrowed. He was not concerned about the broadcast. He was worried about where he would go if there was a problem with the broadcast. Moreover, he had a vague guess in his heart, but he did not dare to think too much about it. Someone is making a revolution. It is really inconvenient for me to express my position now, because it is difficult for the revolution to succeed. He continues to act as if he has not noticed anything. If the revolution fails, he will still be an obedient and good citizen, and even if he wants to join, there seems to be no way to participate in this revolution. Boss, coffee. Xie Zhen came in with 2 cups of coffee. Liang Sen waved his hand to indicate that he didn't need it anymore. Then, he turned around and continued to look up at the dim sky. Are you really going to have a problem? In London, a royal gardener patted the soil on his body and stood up slowly. Even if the Queen walked by him not far away and took the initiative to say hello, he didn't care. His eyes were just staring. He stared at the sky, with a touch of confusion and doubt in his eyes. In Paris, a man in a suit stood in front of the glass window of his office with a cigar in his mouth. He also raised his head and looked at the sky. The head of the cigar flickered, but his mind was not on savoring the richness of the cigar. In a bar in Berlin, a drunk man recklessly took credit and walked out. He supported the wall with one hand and stroked his chest with the other. After a while, he seemed to notice something and raised his hand. Headed. In an ancient temple in India, a dark-skinned young monk slowly put down the beads in his hand and raised his head thoughtfully. Even the Sanskrit sounds around him quietly quieted down at this time, like it was as if she was afraid of disturbing him. This situation is still happening in other corners of the world. Kant once said that the only things that can shock and amaze him are the starry sky he looks up to and the moral principles deep in his heart. But now the big listeners all over the world have lost these 2 things in an instant. The radio suddenly stopped monitoring them, and the moral code that used the principles of radio as a constraint on their behavior was useless at this time. But the vast majority of people are still waiting and watching. To be precise, they can only choose to wait and watch now. And just when the strange beings that could be sensed were looking up to the sky, a green leather train was heading back along the counter-current of nothingness. This train was very deserted, so deserted that it was incredible, because there was only one woman in the whole train. Lychee stretched out her hand at this moment, and a ball of black darkness rippled from Lychee's palm, and then slowly spread to the table, and then spread to the floor, followed by the walls and windows of the carriage. In less than half a minute, the entire car was completely covered in darkness, as if it had been coated with a thick layer of black paint. As expected, you no longer pay attention to this place. Lychee gently raised her hand. The speed of the train suddenly accelerated at this time. She coming back soon. A certain area in Greece suddenly shook at this time. There were not many residents living here, but there were basically no earthquakes here, so these residents were almost dumbfounded at this time. Fortunately, the vibration did not continue to be strong, but began to become gentler and gentler, and finally became calm. In a hilly area in this area, half of an ancient Greek-style palace emerged from the ground. The stone pillars of the palace are densely carved with text, describing how a king who was born here established his glorious empire step by step. This empire was called Macedonia. This king is called Alexander the Great in history. In the palace, there were faint roars, as if the souls of the dead who died in battle more than 2,000 years ago had finally broken free from their chains and were roaring wildly. They were venting, they were shouting, they had been suppressed for 2,000 years. For more than 1,000 years, now, the eye that has been paying attention to them has disappeared at this moment. Fresh free air. They have really been looking forward to it for too long. China, Shaanxi, Xi'an, Lintung. At this time, the Terracotta Warriors and Horses History Museum suddenly announced an emergency closure. Groups of soldiers with live ammunition even entered the place to help quickly disperse the tourists. Residents nearby were also quickly dispersed. A middle-aged man with a general star on his shoulder accompanied a gray-haired old professor in a military jeep and drove into the front of pit number 1 of the Terracotta Warriors and Horses. "What happened?" the soldier asked. The old professor got out of the car and seemed to completely ignore the soldier's question. He just knelt down tremblingly and put his ears to the ground. Then, the grooves on his face suddenly became it went deeper, and then he said tremblingly with a trembling and frightened voice, "I heard below. There are thousands of troops and horses roaring. Only part of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum has been excavated because the excavated terracotta warriors and horses could not be properly protected. The newly unearthed terracotta warriors and horses were colorful, but now they have turned into an earthy yellow like clay dolls due to contact with oxygen in the air. But underneath this area, there is still a large area of mystery to be excavated. The true face of the first emperor's mausoleum has not yet been revealed." "What nonsense are you talking about?" The soldier frowned, got out of the car, and accompanied by several soldiers, walked directly into the number 1 pit where the accident occurred. At this time, the soldiers stationed outside the museum all looked timid and frightened. "Look at your potential, do you still look like a soldier?" the middle-aged soldier scolded and walked inside. When he stood at the observation deck of pit number 1, suddenly, a momentum that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years suddenly burst out. The roar of mountains and tsunami comes directly. Jijiao Laoqin. Let's face the national crisis together. The blood will not dry up. There will be no truce until the end. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 839. The palace is really coming out. At this time, standing outside the exposed palace area, was a woman wearing a white dress. The woman had blonde hair, fair complexion, and a kind of aura that belonged to an Oriental woman. There are 2 stone tablets standing in front of the palace. The ancient words on them describe the short-lived appearance of an ancient empire, but the woman's eyes did not stay too long on the stone tablets. In fact, at her level, it is difficult not to know some things, including the legends and kingdoms created by the 2 monarchs of the East and the West more than 2,000 years ago. However, in the end, due to some unfathomable reasons, both empires they were annihilated one after another. Their annihilation was as fast as their rise, so fast that future generations find it somewhat incredible. It really came out. A black bat landed on the woman's shoulder. The woman was not surprised at all. As 2 big-shot listeners close to each other, she did not believe that the other party would be unable to bear it after such an incident. "Have a look. It's really interesting." The bat opened its mouth and spat out human words. "Your Majesty Alexander, are you ready to wake up?" "It's nothing more than the last murmur of the loser," the woman retorted. "The 2 great monarchs of the East and the West should have completely fallen. Here, there are only the relics left by them, themselves, and even a trace of their souls. It is impossible to survive. If according to what you said, there is no need to suppress them on the radio. This palace was not discovered. The terracotta warriors and horses in China were only discovered because of an accident. But even if they were discovered, no one on the radio would be able to tell the truth about the terracotta warriors and horses. If it affects the real world, it is an army buried underground. What if it's not suppression but protection?" the woman asked. "That's an interesting idea." The bat flew up from the woman's shoulder. "If broadcasters don't take action to hide them, these 2 places will probably become listeners' private areas in the real world. In fact, if these 2 places are really discovered by the audience, it is estimated that they may really become replicas of the real world for the audience. Everyone can go in and try their luck to find something to gain. They can even do it in batches, such as low-level listeners look for opportunities on the periphery, senior listeners are in the middle, senior listeners are on the inner periphery, and the big guys go to the deepest part. With the desperados in the audience, even the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang can be turned into a people's square with people coming and going. When did radio become so kind? Until now, listeners in both the East and the West seem to be unsure of the relationship between radio and the two kings more than 2,000 years ago. Is an opponent still an ally? Therefore, in accordance with the aesthetics and temperament of broadcasting, the woman said no more. So, according to broadcast's temperament, if it is an ally, it will naturally have the responsibility to protect these two relics. If it is an opponent, it can also be interpreted as a kind of respect for the former opponent. In fact, you still said nonsense. Perhaps, someone knows, the woman suddenly said, and I guess that the real culprits who caused the broadcaster to turn his attention away from the real world this time are probably them. That man and woman who are legendary in Eastern listening circles. It can't be the woman named Lychee. I admit that she came to England and wiped out a city. It did leave a big psychological shadow on me, but I don't think that woman had such a short time. It can grow to this point in time. Therefore, after all calculations, there is only the couple from the East. After all, although they disappeared for many years, they also left a lot of things in the West. From these things, we can also see what they are like. How big is the plan you have prepared? Then what should we do? Bat asked and then turned around in the air. Actually, we can't do anything. Yes, nothing can be done. This is already. This is a game that even the big-name audience is not qualified to participate in. You are a chess piece, but you have actually changed from a chess piece to a chess player and started a new game. This seems to be just a change of identity, but it is a different destiny trajectory. Regardless of whether they succeed in the end, I really admire them for being able to force the broadcast to this point, the woman said solemnly. I am responsible for guarding this place, and you are responsible for monitoring the rest of the listeners. If the broadcast is the winner in this game, then it will definitely settle the score later if it does not do its best to help maintain order as instructed. Moreover, no matter whether radio can win in the end this time, even if it wins, it is actually a loss to a certain extent. Its omniscience, omnipotence, and majesty have been seriously damaged, at least in the eyes of listeners at our level. Someone has made it this far, and there will surely be others who will continue down this path. Therefore, even if the broadcast wins in the end, its mood will definitely not be any better, and it will also need a few people to establish its authority. Hearing this, Bat laughed at himself. You know, Xinsalai, I hate this feeling now. Why are the same listeners playing games with the radio, while we can only continue to be dogs for the radio? Your mentality has changed. Xinmali sat cross-legged with her hands spread out. A ray of sunlight covered the palace above the ground, making it impossible to see the situation inside from the outside. Doc, I dare to believe that even that for couples who are competing with broadcasting, they dare not say that what they are facing is real broadcasting. Even. Maybe they themselves are not sure whether the broadcasts at this time are really overwhelming. Still. Playing with them. After saying this, Xinmali closed her eyes and expressed that she was unwilling to waste any more words. But at least they let me see something called hope, the bat muttered, and its body began to split. It slowly transformed from one bat into hundreds of bats and scattered out. Obviously, although there was no verbal agreement, he kept talking about his yearning for freedom and playing chess, but Duck's physical actions were still very sincere. In fact, most of the big-shot listeners in the real world are in this state now. Since the last group of people left by train, the big guys who have attained enlightenment in the past 2 years should be considered the group of people standing at the top of the pyramid now. But when they suddenly looked up, they realized that they were indeed standing at the top of the pyramid, but there was a battle going on outside the atmosphere. They could only stare upward with wide eyes, and could only vaguely see streaks of lightning. Fell, but what exactly happened can only be guessed. As big guys. At this moment, I also deeply experienced a feeling called unclear awareness. Crashed. Really dead? After Subai was shocked at the beginning, he immediately became depressed. The first scene is similar to the murder case in Blizzard Villa. In fact, even without Butler O's explanation, everyone can probably guess what needs to be done. But what exactly the second scene means and what the specific process is has not been explained. The most embarrassing thing is, the gem is still shining there. The 9 listeners were locked in an incubator like a pig cage. Because the gems were weakening them, they simply didn't have the strength to break free from the container. And that ghost, that is, the NPC in the second scene suddenly froze and stopped there. At the moment, it really seemed like a bug in the game, and it was the most disgusting kind of bug where you were stuck in one position and couldn't move. Subai started to hit the outer layer of the container in front of him, but unfortunately, no matter how hard Subai tried, the glass could not be broken, and not even a crack appeared. The rest of the audience over there should be doing the same thing. No matter what the reason is for the ghost to be stuck there, you really can't always be a goldfish in the fish tank, right? Buzz. Subai felt a muffled sound coming from the container diagonally opposite him. Subai pressed his eyes against the glass and looked over, vaguely seeing the human figure in the container changing at that location. The figure no longer resembled a human figure, but became wider, like the body of a bear. Is this the strengthening of the demon clan? Subai thought in his heart. Click, click, click. A crisp sound came from the container over there, and then the container broke. A big bear covered in blood walked out of the container. He didn't take 2 steps before he collapsed on the ground and began to breathe heavily. His hair also began to slowly shrink back, and he gradually returned to the appearance of a normal person. Then, he fainted, and he passed out before he could even run to the gem and dispose of it. There was silence for a few seconds. But then, the sound of boiling water came from the container closest to Subai on the left side, and then the glass began to be corroded, then shattered, and a ball of pus flowed everywhere. A woman whose whole body was rotten struggled to crawl out. Her left eye was empty. This was a Western woman. If I guessed correctly, she should have taken the initiative to pluck out her left eye and crush it to let the corrosion inside the sexual toxins flow out to corrode the glass, but she herself is not immune. But at least she was much better than the tough guy before, because she was still awake, and she actually stood up and walked to Subai's container. She put her single eye on the glass and seemed to be sizing up Subai's identity. There was a sinister and vicious smile on the corner of his mouth. She is Lucy. A necromancer. But her smile at this time meant a special meaning. Because even through the glass, Subai could sense the clear murderous intent on the other party. This woman. She wanted to take this opportunity to remove the people in the remaining containers. Kill them all. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 840. Subai and Lucy have a grudge, because in order to clear his suspicions, Subai initially used Lucy as the target of throwing dirty water. Moreover, on the other hand, Subai was originally Lucy, the target of hunting, but in the end, his attack on Subai became a help for Subai to clear his suspicion. In the end, when the old housekeeper asked about the vote, Subai sat there calmly and drank tea. He cast his name when the overall situation was decided. This is almost a kind of humiliation, a kind of mental humiliation from the high-level audience to you scumbags. However, Subai would not think that the murderous intention in Lucy's eyes was just because of the grievance between the two in the previous scene. Lucy was not that simple, and the audience would not be so naive as to kill purely out of hatred, otherwise it would be exposed. 11 will not survive until now. Lucy's current murderous intention was not only towards Subai, but also towards everyone in the other containers present, even the guy who had just turned into a bear and exploded the container before fainting on the ground. Because, regardless of whether this ghost NPC is really dead or fake, if Lucy kills everyone except herself, not only will she be able to ensure that she survives in this story world, but she will also be able to ensure her own interests. Maximize. Broadcasting is actually very particular about the arrangement of each story world. How many people are there in a story world, how many people will probably die, and how many people will survive. Generally, if there are no accidents or extreme circumstances, the difference between group destruction and one person not dying is the difference. Rarely. Therefore, if Lucy takes the opportunity to kill other people at this time, it will be equivalent to ensuring her own safety and interests from another level. Are you, Wang Yi? The one-eyed Lucy stared ferociously through the glass at Subai, who was still wrapped in the liquid. Subai could understand her eyes. This was a mockery from a senior person to a senior audience. When she suddenly has the ability to decide the life or death of a senior audience member, pleasure will follow. Subai was not nervous, nor did he wave to calm down. The world of this story was in chaos. In fact, at the last moment of the first scene, when Subai found out that the old housekeeper was actually chatting with him about his preferences for radio, Subai felt something was wrong. When the ghost suddenly became motionless, Subai was basically sure of one thing. There must be something wrong with the broadcast. This kind of change and impact is definitely not intentional for the sake of storytelling. It is not in line with the aesthetics of broadcasting to rely on such blunt and unreasonable behavior of NPCs to adjust the story and add variables. Lucy was looking for something outside the container. If nothing else, she was looking for the controller. Of course she couldn't release Subai and then kill him, because both of them were basically harmonious under the weakening effect of the gem. There is no difference between ordinary people, not to mention that she has just poisoned herself with the toxin in her eyes, and now she is even more injured. It is even less possible for her to do anything to the gem, because the gem affects everyone without distinction, not just herself. Once she covers or hides the gem, she herself can regain her strength. But the others will definitely regain their strength as a result, especially Subai in front of her. Once everyone regains their strength, then she would have no chance at all. Many thoughts were running through Subai's mind at this time. The only thing to blame was that his body was too ordinary in an ordinary state. In more advanced terms, Subai has strengthened to the state of returning to nature, unlike Lucy who still needs to hide venom in her eyes, nor like the guy who turned into a black bear and still retains the most primitive transformation gap. This has to be said to be an irony. Soon, Subai saw that Lucy must have found the location of the controller, and then he looked at what the other party pressed. Click. Immediately afterwards, the glass in front of Subai suddenly rose up, and the culture fluid inside was automatically extracted. Subai, who lost his support, subconsciously knelt down on the ground. He was a little confused. Did Lucy press the wrong button? Did she want to suck out all the air or use other methods to kill herself in the container? In the end, he released himself. Wang Yi, is it you? Wang Yi, do you know who I am? I am Diana. The one-eyed woman knelt down on the ground very weakly. The injuries on her body were very serious, especially the corrosive wounds. The effects of secondary injuries and continuous injuries were very obvious. Diana. Isn't it Lucy? Oh, yes, Diana said that she is a necromancer, and Lucy should be a Taoist priest. She uses a mahogany sword and can also use zombies. Suddenly, Subai, who had just come out of the incubator, reached out and grabbed his head. He felt that his mind was now a mess. I just saw this one-eyed woman looking at me with a resentful smile. I also felt the killing intent coming from the other party. But the other party actually let him go, and he really remembered it wrong. The necromancer should be Diana, not Lucy. Could it be that the many images he just saw in the glass container were all his hallucinations? Grass. How could I have such an illusion? How could this be? Subai believed that he was tough-minded, and had experienced the mental test of several broadcasts more easily than others. However, When Diana said that she was Diana, Subai suddenly realized that he seemed to have fallen into a trap from the beginning. Into a fantasy that he created for himself. He raised his head dejectedly and looked at the gems on the stone tablet in front of him. Could it be that this gem not only weakens strength, but also lowers people's IQ? Right now, a person who is still in the incubator is looking at everything in front of him with his eyes wide open. His vision is not very clear, and his body has become as weak as an ordinary person. But Hills is a dual practitioner of magic and martial arts and has the blood of Yamata no Orokai, and Yamata no Orokai is attached to his soul with the soul body, so even if he is an ordinary person now, he can still see some other people. Invisible things. For example, just when the female ghost was stuck, Hills saw that there seemed to be a ball of fire on Sudbai's body, which was constantly penetrating the shackles of the glass container, part of which was transferred to the ghost, and most of the other parts. It was absorbed by the gems on this stone tablet. It turned out that the ghost was motionless. Just after the story background was introduced in the second story scene, the ghost got stuck, and Hills could clearly see the blue flame interactively moving towards the gem throughout the whole process. Transfer. But Subai knelt down there. Did he have some problems with his consciousness because of this? Hills guessed this in his mind. Could it be that the abnormality in this broadcast has something to do with him? This was one of the many thoughts that came to Hills' mind, but Hills didn't think about it for long because he thought it was too ridiculous. Even though he lost the duel between the two before, after all, Subai was just a junior listener, not even a preacher. How could he actually cause such a serious accident on the radio? Did you feel it? Suyuhang, who was standing in mid-air, asked downwards. I sensed the fluctuation of the C-series crystal stone. Is it what was developed in the laboratory you opened with an ordinary person? Lu Menjiao knew about that thing. It is said that advanced listeners at high levels will be suppressed and weakened by the stone, but it later caused attracting the attention of the broadcaster. Suyuhang himself almost died in the punitive story world that time, while his collaborator suffered a brutal death. He locked himself in a safe and died of thirst and starvation. I remember that the broadcast seemed to have specially designed a similar story world, Lu Menjiao continued, but it was not so coincidental. Sudbai's current location is that story world, and at the same time, the poison was spread to the crystal stone. Using that crystal as the new starting point, the spread and effects of the poison will instantly spread out and radiate to the rest of the story world. Speaking of this, Lu Menjiao suddenly fell silent. Because it's all such a coincidence. As they prepare to unleash their toxins to emerge from the shadows, the broadcast happened to place Subai in that story world. Just as he and others were about to set a fire, several barrels of unattended oil appeared on the road ahead. Suyuhang said in a deep voice at this time, it is too confident. Even now, it is still so confident. It wants to use our poison to forcefully change the rules. It doesn't think that the two of us will really be right. What kind of threat does it pose? It wants to use the power of the two of us and even spread our poison. Purpose. It is to forcefully change the rules so that, as a group of consciousness, it can become one with the rules again and increase its authority. For this reason, it does not hesitate to bring all the story worlds at this stage to a standstill. They were old rivals, so Suyuhang could quickly find out the real purpose of the broadcast. Broken jars are broken, and hope is broken. And then stood up. Lu Menjiao smiled slightly, then we can't wait any longer. If it wants to break and then stand up, then we can add more force and let it try to see if it can still stand up after it is broken. Suyuhang stretched out his hand and tore open the void in front of him, disappearing into it. The next moment, Suyuhang's figure appeared next to the woman Xiansalai who had just finished talking to the bat. Hello. Xiansalai seemed to have guessed who was coming, and her greeting was a bit reluctant. Lu Menjiao, on the other hand, also disappeared on the spot and appeared in front of the gate of the Shaanxi Terracotta Warriors and Horses History Museum. There were actually two big-shot audience members nearby. This is a competition. When it kicked off, both sides had no way out. And it's time for everyone to stand in line. I fell asleep on my desk while writing most of this chapter last night. I woke up in the morning and finished writing this chapter and posted it. This chapter is not included in today's update. There should be 2 more updates today. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 841. It's an honor to meet you. Xiansalai turned around, looked at Su Yuhang standing in front of her and said, "Indeed, those who can reach this point can indeed gain the respect and admiration of other listeners. While others still regard radio as the most terrifying nightmare, they have reached the point where they can compete with radio. What about after the honor?" Su Yuhang took 2 steps forward. Xiansalai didn't move, which meant that she would stop in front of Su Yuhang. This was what she should do, and it was a task assigned by the broadcaster. I'm sorry. Xiansalai seemed a little helpless, but her attitude was still firm. In this world, there are not many absolute rights and wrongs. Many times, people really can't help themselves. For example, Xiansalai could completely get out of the way and even actively join Su Yuhang's queue to show her support. But this kind of plot, which can only appear in hot-blooded Japanese comics, is difficult to realize for the audience, because once Su Yuhang fails, those who have been obedient to the broadcast during this period will be liquidated. This is why Xiansalai knew she couldn't stop Su Yuhang but still had to stand in front of him. It's inevitable that we can't stop it. But not stopping is a sin. When Su Yuhang continued to walk forward, Xiansalai opened her hands, and the flowers, plants, and trees on the ground grew at this time, directly rendering this place as a place where elves live. At the same time, the power of nature spreads out, containing infinite vitality. From the beginning, Xiansalai assumed a defensive posture. Su Yuhang stretched out a hand, holding a brush in his hand, and drew casually. This vibrant natural beauty is like a layer of black ink being splashed on it, and it is soaked in layer by layer. The previous vitality begins to disappear, and the green color begins to fade. The desolation of decay and death suddenly became the main theme. Xiansalai staggered, and a wisp of green blood spilled from the corner of her mouth. When Su Yuhang walked past her, 2 cheek sticks drawn in ink wrapped directly around Xiansalai's waist and neck. Imprisoned. Just draw it casually. Breaking down your defenses and imprisoning you at the same time. This is not crushing, this is a description that transcends levels. Xiansalai tried to struggle, but she couldn't shake the iron chain on her body at all. Then she gave up struggling, sighed, and watched Su Yuhang pass by her. She has fulfilled her responsibilities. Even if the broadcast is settled later, she still feels that she is blameless. Is it possible that she is really allowed to die heroically for the sake of broadcasting? Even if it's a broadcast, you wouldn't be so naive, right? Su Yuhang walked tens of meters in a step and came directly to the palace. The palace has experienced more than 2,000 years of erosion. Even though it has been underground before, its initial graceful atmosphere has been almost worn away. But the flavor accumulated over the years and the association of that great empire spanning multiple continents also add to its beauty. Just like the reinforced concrete Lifeng Tower with an elevator in Hangzhou, as long as the sound of waiting for 1,000 years is continuously played inside, visitors can figure out a lot of things on their own. However, Su Yuhang had no intention of coming to pay homage. In fact, he didn't even show any respect. He stretched out his hand directly without greeting or asking. In an instant, he broke the palace's restrictions and entered lightly. Angry auras began to be aimed at Su Yuhang. Alexander the Great had long since disappeared, but there were still those who served under him even after his death. Su Yuhang's arrogant posture naturally attracted their anger, but Su Yuhang's action of breaking Xiansalai's barrier outside with one hand, and then shattering the palace restrictions with one palm, also made these people in the palace survive for 2,000 years. The undead are very afraid. Emperor, you must have left something behind, right? Su Yuhang looked around and clasped his hands behind his back. No. An old voice came from deep inside the palace. We are just taking this opportunity to get some fresh air and have no intention of getting involved in anything else. So, friend, please go back to where you came from. Su Yuhang's mouth showed a mocking smile. Just to come out for some air? When the emperor fell, you people betrayed the emperor's will and followed the darkness to the east. Now, I have the opportunity to break that thing, but you only say that you came up for some air? Is it possible that the spine has been bent and cannot be straightened again? Su Yuhang's voice carries an undoubted majesty. In fact, he has been immersed in Chinese studies since he was a child and has learned the art of nourishing qi. Just like a monk can still look like an eminent monk no matter what crazy things he does, Su Yuhang, regardless of his underhanded tactics, at least his appearance and speech always give people an aura of awe-inspiring righteousness. This is probably the so-called personality charm. Otherwise, how could Ji Xiang be deceived by Su Yuhang into leaving the place of enlightenment? People who have gone there to preach over the years have never thought of taking a cat out as a pet? It's useless, you haven't realized its true horror, the old voice from the depths continued. Alexander the Great once led his army into Egypt to fight. The targets of the war were not the native Egyptians at that time, but a group of devils descended from the sky. However, he failed and himself fell. The remaining troops finally chose to surrender to the darkness. Surrender. Therefore, the record Subai saw in the underground caves of Tibet about the princess of the Qin dynasty leading an army to fight the group of Westerners probably meant that the Westerners who surrendered to the darkness were used as advance troops to come to the east. I just want to ask one last question, what should the emperor leave behind? I don't believe that a person like that will not reserve any backups. No, really not, the other party continued. Then there's nothing we can do. Su Yuhang was very puzzled. I can't go all the way in vain. For a moment, the dead souls in the palace shook. Obviously, because of Su Yuhang's words, all the dead souls here were extremely angry. Just imagine, a junior who is more than 2,000 years younger than you speaks nonsense in front of you, what will you do? What does it feel like? Su Yuhang stretched out his hand and raised it slightly. For a moment, a terrifying power burst out from Su Yuhang's body, suppressing the collective silence of the 1,000-year-old souls in the palace. They could not even save their own souls under the pressure of this huge power, let alone this. I never said anything angry again. Xiansalai, who was imprisoned outside the palace, saw a scene that sent chills down her back. The entire palace began to rise at this time, floating in the air after completely breaking away from the ground. At the same time, it continued to rise. Years ago, a woman named Lizzie came to England and wiped out a city. Today, a man who disappeared for 20 years carried a palace that was built more than 2,000 years ago. Are you going to stop me? Lu Menjiao stood there without moving, and neither did the two big-shot audience members. Perhaps, the mentality of these two boss-level listeners is actually the same as that of the boss named Xiansalai in the West at the same time. Everyone and everything is actually changeable and can be analyzed according to materialist dialectics. In the eyes of the audience, Su Yuhang and his wife were considered seniors, and could even be described as idols and guiding lights. However, in Subai's eyes, they were two scum who wanted to eat their flesh and drink their blood. Just as there are 1,000 Hamlets for 1,000 readers. Lu Menjiao did not make it difficult for these two boss-level listeners who cannot help themselves. If placed during the anti-Japanese war, these two people were a bit like puppet soldiers, but they still had some conscience. Of course, This was based on Lu Menjiao's on the basis of reputation and absolutely tyrannical strength, otherwise, they would probably not hesitate to capture Lu Menjiao and send him to the broadcaster to increase his favorability. It's not difficult for these two big bosses to be in the audience, not because they are compatriots, nor because they are their juniors, but because Lu Menjiao doesn't actually need to go in here. More than 2,000 years ago, the two monarchs of the East and the West gathered their armies to fight against darkness. After the fall of Alexander, the remaining armies of the West chose to compromise, while the first emperor of the East persisted in fighting until the Jade Seal collapsed and the empire annihilation. From Zilong to every Qin soldier below sang that Qin song loudly and went to death with joy. Liu Bang was just a rogue pavilion chief, and Xiangyu was just a second-generation nobleman. If the first emperor hadn't lost that war, history would never have left such an ending to Qin. Lu Menjiao's body floated, but the two boss-level audience members did not follow up. As long as Lu Menjiao did not attempt to directly enter the pit of the terracotta warriors and horses, they would not stop him. Knowing that they can't fight hard, everyone hopes to save a little more face for themselves. But in the air, Lu Menjiao's soul power spread out, and he used his soul to transmit the message. Today, 2,000 years later, I need your help to face the enemies of the past together. I just want to ask. Old Qin people. Dare you fight again? Soul transmission, no real sound. The soldiers in the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum only felt dizzy and sick, but they didn't know what happened. But then, groups of white dead souls rise from the depths of the earth. It started one after another. Then came one piece after another. They have already fallen, along with the coffin of the first emperor after the defeat. But today, when they have the opportunity to fight their former enemies again, they who have been dead for a long time have reunited their thoughts in the dark. Fighting spirit, prepare to follow the first emperor's chariot to the battlefield just like before. Jeju, Lao Qin, fight against the national calamity together. There will be no truce until the blood is shed dry. In the past, there was the great Qin dynasty, which was rising like the sun. The country was hated for thousands of years, and the sea was difficult to calm down. Who can compete with Qin's elite warriors? The war song of Qin opera echoed over Qinchuan 800 miles away again after more than 2,000 years. Lu Menjiao smiled slightly. She knew that her side was much easier than Su Yuhang's side. Yes. She, Lu Menjiao, took advantage of them. But why don't they know? Only willing ears. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 842. Are you not satisfied with your life? I haven't laughed in a long time and I don't know why. Since I'm not happy and don't like this place. Why not go all the way west to Dali? In a small bar in Kayakan, a relatively fat man was sitting at the top singing this song affectionately. I didn't realize before that Fatty can sing quite nicely. Lord Fo took a sip of beer and leaned slightly to one side of the sofa. Except for the appearance of 5 Indian bodhisattvas at the beginning, which almost caused the situation to collapse, the past 2 days have been uneventful. In this romantic place, it is a bit difficult for you to do as the Romans do. Of course, this is also because whether you are a Buddha or a monk, are not the type of ascetic monks, they also know the principles of adapting measures to local conditions and taking pleasure in time. After the fat man finished his song, many of the drinkers clapped and expressed their gratitude. The fat man even bowed, walked down with his face glowing, and sat down at the table where Buddha and the monk were sitting. The three of them drank wine and looked at the stars. For the audience, it was already a luxurious and decadent feeling. The fat man lit a cigarette, took out his mobile phone and flipped through it casually. Then, he let out a surprised sound. This, the story world I originally planned for a week later has been cancelled. Cancelled, the monk said a little surprised. A second notice was sent. No, I just took it out and took a look. It originally informed me that I would enter the story world a week later, on the 27th, but now the time has been erased. The fat man shook his head. It can't be because of being arranged before. Did any of the listeners who were about to enter the story world suddenly die suddenly in the real world? Even if there is a problem with the audience arrangement, the broadcaster can randomly arrange someone to take over. After all, the names of people who do not know each other are blurred, and replacement is not difficult. Monk analyzed. Or maybe the broadcaster thinks that the story world will not be interesting because that person is missing. FOIA guessed. Broadcasting has a paranoid pursuit of storytelling, but it does not have obsessive-compulsive disorder, nor is it an absolute aesthete. The monk shook his head. This explanation does not make sense. But if your explanation doesn't make sense, the other explanation that follows will make even less sense. Buddha smiled. Because another explanation is that there is a problem with the broadcast. It's not like there have been problems with the broadcast once or twice. What's so surprising, the monk retorted, not counting things in the story world, let's just talk about the blood corpse incident. If the fat man hadn't said it accidentally, with the name Yezi, the broadcast couldn't do anything about the bloody corpse. Moreover, we know that Subai's parents are not dead and have escaped the broadcast's attention. Is this considered a problem caused by the broadcast? Monk, you're being arrogant. It's understandable that you have some problems, but if you mean that the broadcast has to be suspended because of other things, even the originally arranged story world missions, then that's really too much. It's unbelievable, Buddha said after taking a sip of wine. Oh, then the scheduled mission here has been erased and postponed unconditionally. What does that mean? With that said, the monk took out his mobile phone. There may be something really wrong with the radio. All 9 people finally came out of the incubator. Diana made a strange choice. She took the initiative to release the rest of the people from the incubator, which led to the current atmosphere. A little too harmonious. Of course, this is also because the ghost is still in a dead state and has remained motionless for nearly 2 hours. There is no specific task, and there is no conflict of interest. This is the essential reason for such a harmonious atmosphere at the moment. Don't put too much expectations on the audience's conscience. How much is the audience's conscience worth? Chenming and Mengtalai spent some time, and at this time they seemed to really understand a little bit about the machine control here. They pressed a button on the command board, which caused a glass cover to slowly fall from above, and the gems were given to them. Covered in. This glass cover should also be made of special materials, because when it wraps the gem, everyone can clearly feel that the power in their bodies is slowly recovering. After the strength was restored, the hierarchy and identity became clear. Hill sat next to Subai. This was a small group, and the rest were divided into 2 other small groups. Both Chenming and Muntari used honorific titles when they came to greet Hills. Hills didn't pay much attention to it. He was just a little concerned. No, he was curious about Subai's current situation. Even though Subai's strength was gradually recovering, Subai felt that something in his brain seemed to be getting worse. For example, everyone he looks at seems to have absolute malice, and everyone seems to want to kill him. The grass and trees are all soldiers, and the shadows of snakes and cups can all describe Subai's mental state at this time. And Hills was curious about this. Moreover, Hills saw a blue flame rising from Subai's body, even though Hills was not willing to admit it at first or even intended to show it to that person. He wanted to think in this direction, but the facts and all the clues he encountered now had to make him consider that aspect. Subai took a deep breath, as if he was trying his best to get out of his previous state, but the effect was not great. Fortunately, with the recovery of his strength, Subai finally became calmer. No matter at any time, if the strength is still with you, it is like a veteran with a gun in his hand, so he will not be so panicked. I feel something is wrong, Subai said. Nonsense, Hills chuckled and continued, guess what I just saw. Speak quickly and don't beat around the bush. Subai pursed his lips and said. I see you are like a radiation source, constantly spreading something outward. Moreover, I even suspect that the reason why this ghost NPC is stuck here now seems to be because of that thing on you. Radiation source, Subai said with some confusion. I didn't feel it. I only felt that my spirit began to become more and more depressed. No, it became more and more extreme, more and more. It's becoming more and more like a person who has reached a dead end. No one has the slightest sense of security anymore, right? Hills continued Subai's words. Yes, Subai nodded. This was indeed how he felt now, but you said I caused this ghost, hiss. Subai suddenly took a breath of air, because he suddenly felt that the feeling was a little stronger just now. At the same time, in a cold city, two experiencers were forced into a desperate situation by a ghost. They were already at the edge of the rooftop, but the woman covered in blood was still approaching step by step. Just when the two experiencers were about to have a fight, the woman covered in blood suddenly stopped there, neither speaking nor taking action. Even the cold aura that had been exuding from her body could no longer be felt at this time. What happened? I don't know either, but I think we should leave here right now. Our previous escape route was wrong. We should find shelter in a nearby temple instead of walking to a dead end. The two experiencers mustered up the courage to go around the female ghost, but the female ghost still stopped in place, motionless, seeming to have completely forgotten her responsibilities and the mission she had been given in this story world. In another glacier, 3 veterans were being attacked by more than a dozen frozen zombies. These zombies emerged from under the ice and were still wearing ancient armor. They looked extremely ferocious. At the same time, their power no less than a senior and low-level listener, under the siege of more than a dozen zombies, these 3 seniors who had different intentions and had other thoughts could only fight and retreat. But at this moment, these dozen zombies suddenly stopped, and their bodies began to melt. Slowly, as the ice on their bodies melted, the bones of these zombies slowly began to smell and rot, turning into there were more than a dozen pools of pus. The 3 seniors looked at each other, confused as to what was going on. Weird things like this, which were obviously out of touch with the plot of the story world, spread like a virus. During the same period, half of the NPCs in the story world had abnormalities that were difficult to understand. Subai's eyes were getting redder and redder. Hill's guess was correct. Subai was like a radiation source, constantly radiating to the outside world. However, Hills didn't think so exaggeratedly, nor did he. Knowing that there are now a dozen story worlds at the same time is already causing problems. Subai, on the other hand, felt that his emotions were becoming more and more extreme, inexplicably extreme. No one came to stimulate him, but he couldn't help but think that everyone around him wanted to kill him, even those sitting next to him. Hills, Subai seemed to hear the other party whispering in his ears that he wanted to kill him. Damn it, what the hell is going on, what the hell is going on? What the hell is going on the radio? Subai roared almost angrily. The other listeners seemed to have noticed something was wrong with Subai, but because of Subai's senior audience's breath and the person sitting next to Subai Hills, the others did not dare to get too close. Anyone with a discerning eye can see that Subai's current state is really unstable, as if he is in a state of going berserk at any time. I said, "What's wrong with you?" Hills asked. "Besides, I don't think it's the radio." Subai grabbed his head with both hands, and his body trembled uncontrollably, as if he was addicted to drugs. However, it was really unbelievable for this situation to happen to a senior audience member. Subai's eyes were staring straight ahead. In front of him was the glass culture container where he was just now. Suddenly, a picture like this appeared in Subai's mind. In the screen. Every time I want to emerge from the petri dish and leave, that elegant man will appear in front of him. He stretched out his hand to hold his head and pushed himself back down. Once. Again. Countless times. And now. Exactly the same feeling.